Park it here again, and you'll be fined $1,000 a day." Marcus Greer's voice sliced through the air, smug and loud enough for half the cul-de-sac to hear. He stood by the curb with his clipboard angled like a badge, eyes fixed not on me, but on my sister Emily. She clutched her belly, 7 months pregnant, one hand resting against our late father's old Ford. Marcus jabbed a finger at the car like it was contraband, his grin sharp and deliberate. "Pregnancy doesn't excuse violations," he added, savoring every word. I stepped closer, steady, not raising my voice. "Funny thing, Marcus." I let the words hang, the neighbors shifting uneasily. "That's not just a car, and those rules you're waiving, they're about to get tested against federal code I helped write." The smile slipped from his face for a flicker of a second. Just a flicker. "My name's Daniel Mercer," I said, calm but firm, letting his clipboard hover useless in the space between us. "Federal compliance auditor. I've spent the last decade training agencies on how evidence holds up, or collapses, under pressure. And this driveway, this car, you're not prepared for what happens if you try to strip them away." His pen froze mid-click, and for the first time, the neighbors leaned in, curious instead of afraid. I ran a hand along the Ford's hood, metal warm under the fading Texas sun. "My father rebuilt this car with his hands, bolt by bolt, after chemo took his strength. It was the last project he finished before we buried him. My sister drives it because it feels like he's still here. You call it a violation. We call it a promise." Emily's eyes shimmered, and I caught the hush ripple through the gathering crowd. This wasn't about paint lines or bylaws. It was about memory carved into steel. The tires still smelled faintly of rubber and road dust, the cabin faint with engine oil he used to swear by. Every scrape on its frame was a story we carried forward. Marcus didn't see a legacy, he saw an easy target, and he thought we'd fold like the others. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. I watched his jaw twitch as the neighbors' silence shifted. They weren't nodding in his favor. They weren't flinching when he lifted that clipboard. For once, their eyes followed me instead. That was when I knew he'd made a mistake. He thought he could shove Emily, literally shove her, into compliance and no one would fight back. But he hadn't realized who he was standing across from. Emily's hand pressed tighter against the curve of her belly, and I felt the air change. The sun dipped lower, shadows crawling across the Ford's hood. Every sound, the buzz of cicadas, the crunch of gravel under someone's shoes, seemed louder in the pause that followed. Marcus was waiting for me to break eye contact, to look down, to yield. I didn't. "Where are you watching from?" I asked, my voice low, meant for everyone, not just him. "Because tonight, this street becomes the line." And Marcus... I took one step closer until the air between us was charged and sharp. "You picked the wrong family to try and erase." The neighbors didn't move, Emily didn't flinch, and I didn't blink. The fight hadn't even started, but already Marcus was off balance. Marcus didn't answer, his jaw set, his clipboard tucked tighter against his chest, and he stormed back toward the HOA office with the kind of stiff, clipped steps that told me he wasn't retreating. He was regrouping. Neighbors watched him disappear into the glass-fronted building at the end of the cul-de-sac, its fluorescent lights already humming against the evening sky. No one followed, no one defended him. For a second, the air held the charged silence. Then people began drifting away, murmuring, eyes still flicking back toward Emily and me. I helped her inside, but my mind was already moving toward that office. Marcus wasn't finished, and I knew it. Men like him didn't crave order, they craved control. If tonight rattled him, he'd come back harder, armed with more paperwork and more threats. He'd dress up intimidation in the language of authority until neighbors confused his posturing with power. By the next morning, the HOA office door was plastered with fresh notices. I walked past a bulletin board sagging under the weight of violation slips and warnings. Grass too long, patio furniture unsanctioned, window blinds the wrong shade of white. Each slip bore Marcus's signature, a looping scrawl that had started to look more like a brand than an autograph. A mother with a stroller paused to read hers, lips pressed tight, eyes darting toward the office like she was afraid he'd step out and catch her protesting. She didn't rip it down. She folded the paper and shoved it in the stroller's basket as if even discarding it was dangerous. Inside, the air smelled of toner and floor polish. A fan whirred lazily against a wall of binders labeled bylaws, though I knew most of those codes hadn't been revised in years. I studied the laminated sheet taped near the reception desk. Community standards enforcement, safety first. The irony burned. None of this was about safety. It was about obedience. Neighbors filtered in with tight shoulders, glancing at me like I was either brave or reckless for standing there. One older man slipped me a look that lingered, half gratitude, half warning. I understood it. They'd seen Marcus push his authority too far before. They'd seen what happened to anyone who resisted. Extra fines, harassment, the quiet kind of punishment you couldn't prove but always felt. Emily called me while I was still in the lobby. Her voice was shaky, brittle around the edges. "Another notice," she said, "taped right to Dad's car this time." I closed my eyes, steadying myself before I answered. That was Marcus's move. Humiliate in public, escalate through paper. It was working on the others. It wasn't going to work on me. I walked out with the crowd, the late morning heat pressing down on the sidewalks. A few neighbors avoided my eyes, but one woman muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "He's been doing this for months." She didn't stop walking, didn't look back, but the truth clung to the air between us. This wasn't my family's fight alone. It was a neighborhood under siege. Back at Emily's, the notice flapped against the Ford's windshield. "Threatening behavior, escalating fines," it read in bold print. Marcus had twisted last night into an accusation against her. My sister stood by the car, fists balled against her hips, lips trembling with fury she couldn't afford to let spill. "He shoved me, and now I'm the one they're calling dangerous," she whispered. I reached out, tore the notice free, and held it in my hand. The paper was thin, the ink cheap, but the weight of it was heavy. Another brick in a wall Marcus thought he was building around us. I wasn't going to let it stand. Not this time. The neighbors who had lingered last night were watching again from their porches. They weren't stepping in, not yet, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Doubt in Marcus. Doubt in the system they'd been too afraid to question. And for the first time, I felt the balance shift, just slightly, as if the ground under Marcus's authority wasn't as solid as he wanted us all to believe. I crumpled the notice in my hand and looked at Emily. "This isn't over," I said. And in the hush of the cul-de-sac, with the Ford gleaming stubbornly behind us, I knew Marcus had just given me the first real crack in his armor. I still felt the grit of the crumpled notice in my palm when a soft knock rattled Emily's screen door. The cul-de-sac was quiet again, neighbors tucked behind curtains, but the figure shifting on our porch wasn't Marcus. It was Evelyn Harper, the HOA's secretary. She stood with a manila folder clutched to her chest like a shield, her shoulders angled away as if she might bolt at any second. "Daniel," she said, her voice thin, the word almost breaking apart. She didn't look at me directly. Her eyes darted from the Ford to Emily's stomach, then to the notice still clamped in my fist. Her lips pressed together before she finally stepped inside. The kitchen smelled of coffee gone cold. Evelyn set the folder on the table, but didn't open it. Her hands lingered on the cover, fingers flexing like she wanted to take it back. Emily slid into a chair, one hand on her belly, and I leaned against the counter, waiting. Evelyn's body spoke before her words did. Her foot tapped under the table. Her eyes flicked toward the window every time a car passed, and her breaths came shallow and clipped. I shouldn't even be here," she murmured. She twisted the thin chain around her neck, metal flashing under the light. "Marcus, he wouldn't want me talking to you." Her voice cracked on his name. I stayed silent, letting the weight hang. Silence has a way of forcing truth to the surface. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the Ford again, softening. She knew what that car meant. She knew what Marcus had done. But her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw the war inside her, the loyalty to the board that signed her checks, and the guilt eating at her ribs every time she replayed what she'd seen. Her hands trembled as she pushed the folder an inch across the table, then stopped herself. "You need to understand," she whispered. "Marcus, he thinks he's protecting the community. He tells the board the neighborhood's safer because of him. But," she trailed off, chewing her lip, knuckles whitening as she gripped the folder again. Emily's chair creaked as she shifted forward. "He shoved me, Evelyn. In front of everyone. Do you call that protection?" Her voice was calm, but the tremor beneath it carried more power than anger ever could. Evelyn flinched, guilt flashing across her face. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she sat, shoulders caved, gaze fixed on the table's wood grain. Her foot tapped faster, a metronome of anxiety. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shook her head. Number, I don't. The words spilled out like she hadn't meant to say them aloud. I leaned in, lowering my voice. Then why keep covering for him? Evelyn's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She looked up finally, eyes glassy, and the conflict in them was almost painful to watch. Because if I don't, he'll turn on me too. You've seen what he does to people who cross him. Extra fines, false notices. He makes it unbearable until you give in. I've seen neighbors put their houses up for sale just to get out. She stopped, pressing her fingers hard into her temples, as if she could hold the words back. And I've helped him do it. Every notice, every signature. My name is on those too. Her body betrayed her more than her voice. Shoulders hunched, one hand gripping the folder so tight her knuckles turned pale, the other twisting that necklace chain until I thought it might snap. She wanted to hand me the truth. She was terrified of it. The room was heavy with her hesitation. Outside, cicadas buzzed, their drone filling the silence she left. Finally, she exhaled, long and shaky. I can't give you this, she said, tapping the folder once with her nail. Not yet, but... Her eyes darted toward Emily again, softer now, almost maternal. I'll be watching, and if he pushes again, if he crosses another line, I'll come forward. She rose, chair legs scraping against the tile, and for a second, her hand lingered on the folder. Then she pulled it back, clutching it to her chest as she hurried for the door. Her exit was quick, her footsteps sharp against the porch wood, but the tremor in her hands as she gripped the doorknob told me enough. She was cracking. Emily's sigh filled the quiet once she was gone. I looked at the empty chair Evelyn had left, the faint circle of condensation from her untouched glass of water. She hadn't given us the folder, but she'd given us something else, a glimpse of the fracture in Marcus's wall, and I knew that fracture was going to split wide open. The front door clicked shut behind Evelyn, and for a long moment, the house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Emily rubbed her stomach in slow circles, her eyes fixed on the folder Evelyn had almost given me. She's scared, Emily said softly. Scared of him, scared of losing everything. I nodded, though my attention had already shifted back to Marcus. Fear was the only leverage he had. Strip that away, and the whole facade crumbled. The problem was, men like Marcus doubled down when they felt cornered. He'd be back, and he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The next afternoon, I didn't have to wait long. A hard rap shook Emily's front door, followed by the sound of tape tearing. By the time I reached the porch, Marcus was already marching down the walkway. On the Ford's windshield, a fresh notice glared in bold letters. Threatening conduct, $1,000 escalating fine. I ripped it free and called after him, but he didn't turn. His posture was stiff, his shoulders squared like a soldier returning to his barracks. The clipboard slapped against his thigh with each step, a steady metronome of defiance. Neighbors peeked through blinds and half-open doors. They didn't need to hear the details. They could read the headline from where they stood. Marcus wasn't backing down. He was rewriting the story. Last night's shove was gone. In its place, Emily was the aggressor, and Marcus was the victim of a dangerous homeowner. I crumpled the paper in my fist and headed straight to the community park at the center of the neighborhood. It was late afternoon, kids playing tag between the swings, parents lingering on benches. The same benches Marcus patrolled every weekend, clipboard in hand, waiting for rules to break themselves. As I approached, heads turned. Some parents shifted uncomfortably, gathering their kids closer, as if being seen near me might earn them a notice too. That's how deep Marcus's reach ran. Fear disguised as compliance. I raised the paper high enough for everyone to see. He shoved my pregnant sister, I said, my voice carrying over the clatter of chains and laughter. The kids froze, parents stared. And now he's charging her $1,000 for it. The silence that followed was heavier than the Texas heat. A few parents exchanged glances, uneasy but awake in a way they hadn't been before. I could see the truth settling in. What Marcus had done to Emily, he could do to any of them. On the far side of the park, Marcus stood near the picnic shelter, arms folded, eyes locked on me. His mouth curved into that thin smile, the one that dared me to keep going. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The notice in my hand said enough. I walked closer, slow and deliberate, until we were 10 feet apart. The wood chips crunched under my shoes, the smell of cut grass sharp in the air. "You think you can rewrite what happened?" I asked quietly enough that only he could hear. "Every neighbor saw you shove her. Every camera did too." His smile flickered, but only for a second. "Cameras can be edited," he muttered, barely moving his lips. The words slipped out like a threat disguised as fact. And that was when it clicked. Evelyn's hesitation. The folder she'd nearly given me. The way she'd said, "I've helped him do it." He wasn't just bluffing. He'd been tampering with recordings. Maybe not all, but enough. Enough to keep the board blind. Enough to keep himself untouchable. The knowledge settled in me like steel. He thought intimidation would hold. He thought doctored footage would bury the truth. But I wasn't just a neighbor with a grudge. I'd spent my career teaching agencies how to prove when evidence was compromised. And Marcus had just handed me the rope he was going to hang himself with. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the mulch. Neighbors lingered at the edges, not close enough to intervene, but close enough to hear. Marcus kept his arms folded, his jaw tight, but I could see the twitch in his temple. He'd revealed more in one slip than he intended. I turned away, the crumpled notice still in my hand, and walked back across the park. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to convince anyone right then. The seed was planted. The neighbors had seen the fine. They'd heard my words, and they'd seen Marcus's silence. By the time I reached Emily's porch again, I knew one thing with certainty. Marcus had escalated the fight, but in doing so, he'd exposed his weakest point, and I was going to use it. I sat on Emily's porch steps, the crumpled notice still in my hand, but my mind had already shifted from anger to calculation. Marcus's careless words in the park replayed in my head. Cameras can be edited. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but he had, and that was enough. Most neighbors wouldn't have caught it, but I did. For years, my entire job had been about noticing what didn't line up, what time stamp didn't match, what frame didn't sync. Evidence left fingerprints even when people thought they'd wiped them clean. By evening, I was back in my office at the city building downtown. The hum of servers filled the air, the faint glow of monitors casting long shadows across the stacks of case files and audit logs. This wasn't the neighborhood cul-de-sac anymore. This was my ground, where Marcus couldn't touch me, where I held the advantage. I logged into the compliance software I'd trained half the state to use. It wasn't flashy, just meticulous. Every digital file carried a chain of custody, a trail that revealed when and how it had been handled. Marcus might have been smug in the park, but if he'd tampered with body cam footage, the metadata would betray him. And unlike Marcus's clipboard, my records actually meant something in court. I pulled the data packet from the HOA's so-called security system, the body cams Marcus required his patrol team to wear. The files were supposed to sync automatically to a cloud archive, but the instant I opened them, the first inconsistency jumped out. One video cut off at 8:43 p.m. Another resumed at 8:46. In between, 3 minutes were missing. 3 minutes on the exact night Marcus shoved Emily. The numbers weren't just off. They were manipulated. The checksum values, the digital fingerprints of each file, didn't match. That meant editing. That meant tampering. And it meant Marcus had made his first verifiable mistake. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The screen's glow washed across the certificates on my office wall. Federal training in evidence retention, forensic auditing, compliance verification. To Marcus, those were just papers. To a judge, they were the reason my word carried weight. The deeper I dug, the more the pattern emerged. Other files bore the same scars, minute long skips, mismatched time stamps, gaps that could only exist if someone had gone in with editing software. He hadn't even covered his tracks well. Maybe he thought no one would ever look. Maybe he thought neighbors too scared to speak would never question his version of events. But I wasn't just another neighbor. I knew what this meant. In a courtroom, missing minutes weren't just suspicious. They were grounds for dismissal of any claim he made. Worse for him, Tampering with evidence transformed an HOA violation into a matter of criminal liability. That was my wedge, the gap in the armor I could drive a stake through. I copied the files onto a secure drive and encrypted them. If Marcus caught wind that I had them, he'd try to shut the system down or bury me in more bogus fines. But the truth was out of his hands now. The evidence lived in a place where he couldn't reach it, and soon, a judge would see what he'd tried to hide. The office window looked out over downtown Dallas, the city lights glittering like broken glass scattered across the horizon. It was strange, sitting here in the glow of screens, while back in the neighborhood, Marcus probably thought he was tightening his grip. He didn't know the leash was already around his neck. I rubbed a hand over my face, tired but steady. Emily's voice echoed from earlier, the hurt in her words when she'd whispered, "He shoved me, and now I'm the one they're calling dangerous." Number not anymore. The files told the truth she couldn't speak loud enough to silence his lies. Somewhere between the hum of the servers and the steady blink of the cursor on my screen, resolve hardened inside me. Marcus wanted obedience. He wanted fear, but he'd crossed into a territory he didn't understand, the kind where every skipped second, every corrupted file, every missing minute became evidence against him. And I was going to make sure the right eyes saw it. The files were safe, locked away on my secure drive, but the weight of them pressed heavier with each passing hour. I left the office after dark, the glow of monitors still flickering behind me, and drove straight to the hospital. Emily had called earlier, her voice tight with the kind of exhaustion that comes from more than just pregnancy. Stress had begun to bleed into her health, and the guilt of it gnawed at me. The maternity ward smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm linen. The hum of machines filled the hall as I followed the nurse's directions to her room. Emily sat propped up in bed, hands resting protectively across her stomach, her skin pale under the fluorescent lights. A monitor beeped steadily at her side, but even I could tell her breathing was too shallow, too forced. "They said the stress could trigger complications," she whispered as soon as I stepped through the door. Her eyes flicked to the window, the blinds casting shadows across her face. "I didn't think it would get this bad, Daniel. I didn't think he could get in my head like this." I pulled a chair closer, the vinyl creaking under my weight, and leaned forward. "He wants you to believe he has that kind of power. That's how he wins. But I've seen what's on those cameras, and I know what he's done to them. He's not untouchable." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket, knuckles pale. For a moment she looked like she wanted to believe me, like hope might finally outweigh fear. Then her gaze drifted to the door, as if she expected Marcus to barge in with another notice, clipboard raised like a weapon. That's what he'd done to this place, turned every knock into a threat. A doctor entered, clipboard in hand, his white coat brushing the side of the curtain. He gave me a brief nod before addressing Emily. "Your vitals are stable for now, but we can't ignore the spikes. Stress has a direct effect, and if it continues, we'll need to consider an early intervention." His tone was clinical, but his eyes lingered with concern. I felt my chest tighten. Early intervention meant risk, for her, for the baby. Marcus's harassment wasn't just harassment anymore. It was bleeding into life and death. When the doctor left, Emily's voice trembled. "I can't keep living like this. Every day feels like another battle. What if he wins, Daniel? What if he takes everything Dad left us and I bring a child into a world where we're still fighting him?" I reached for her hand, the same way I had when we buried our father, when grief threatened to pull us both under. "He won't win, not this time. I've already found the proof we need, and when the right eyes see it, he won't be able to touch us. You just focus on keeping that baby safe. Let me carry the rest." The monitor beeped steadily, filling the quiet that followed. Emily's eyes glistened, but she nodded, her fingers squeezing mine with surprising strength. That was all I needed, a sign she hadn't given up. I stood and looked out the window. Below, the hospital parking lot gleamed under streetlights, cars moving like shadows across the asphalt. Somewhere out there, Marcus probably thought his notices and threats had worn us down. He couldn't see what I held in my hands. He couldn't imagine the kind of weight missing minutes on a body cam could carry in a court. The urgency settled hard in my chest as I watched Emily rest her head back against the pillow, eyelids heavy. The stakes weren't theoretical anymore. They weren't about fines or bylaws or petty violations. They were about her health, her safety, the child she carried, and the memory of the man who'd built that fort with his bare hands. I left the room with my jaw tight and my fists clenched. The hum of machines followed me into the hall, a reminder that time was no longer on our side. Marcus had escalated this into something far more dangerous than a neighborhood dispute, and I couldn't afford to wait. By the time I stepped into the night air, resolve burned hotter than the Texas heat. The files weren't just leverage anymore. They were a lifeline, and I was going to put them in front of someone who could end this before Marcus pushed any further. The hospital's automatic doors slid shut behind me, sealing away the antiseptic air and steady beeping of machines. The night pressed close, thick and humid, as I walked across the parking lot. I'd barely unlocked my car when I noticed a figure waiting in the shadows near the lamppost. Shoulders drawn tight, arms crossed over a cardigan, her face pale in the glow of the streetlight. Evelyn Harper. She stepped forward, hesitant, like every movement cost her something. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely carrying over the cicadas. "We need to talk." I glanced around the lot. A handful of nurses walked to their cars, none paying us any attention. Still, Evelyn's eyes flicked nervously from one shadow to the next, as if Marcus might step out at any moment. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered, her hands twisted together, knuckles white, body swaying like she might collapse under the weight of her own words. "I saw what he did to your sister. I saw it with my own eyes. And then," she faltered, swallowing hard, "then I helped him cover it." I froze, the night air heavy in my lungs. "You what?" Her arms wrapped tighter across her chest, nails digging into her sleeves. "He came into the office right after it happened. He told me to log the footage, but not the whole file. He said if anyone asked, I should say the camera glitched. I did it. Daniel, I cut out the section where he shoved her. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just following orders. But it wasn't nothing." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hand against her mouth like she could shove the words back in. The parking lot buzzed with electricity from the lamps overhead, a low hum underscoring her confession. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Evelyn, what you just told me, that's evidence tampering. That's not a mistake. That's a crime. And you know what happens if this goes before a judge? You're in the middle of it." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't back away. "I know," she whispered. "I've been sick over it. I haven't slept. Every time I see Emily, I think about what I did. He's been doing this for months, Daniel. Editing tapes, writing false reports, twisting the board to believe him. And her hands trembled violently now. I kept stamping my name on every notice. Her guilt hung thick in the air, almost tangible. But beneath it, I heard the sound I'd been waiting for. The fracture. The first real crack in Marcus's wall of silence. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. She lifted her chin, though her body betrayed her with a nervous sway. "Because I saw her at the park, pregnant, terrified, and still trying to stand her ground. I couldn't keep carrying this. And because..." Her voice dropped lower, heavy with fear. "He told me if anyone questioned the notices again, he'd find a way to push them out. Push them out. His words, not mine." I felt my stomach knot. Marcus wasn't just issuing fines. He was threatening forced removal. That was more than intimidation. That was grounds for dismantling the entire board if I could prove it. Evelyn's hands shook as she pulled something from her purse. A flash drive, small and silver, edges worn smooth. She pressed it into my palm with trembling fingers. "This has the raw logs from the cameras, before I cut them. I shouldn't have kept a copy, but I did. I don't know why. Maybe because some part of me knew I'd need it one day. Use it, Daniel, please. End this." For a moment, neither of us moved. The weight of that drive in my hand was heavier than any notice Marcus had taped to Emily's car. It was proof. It was leverage. It was the first piece of truth pried loose from the lie he'd built around us. Evelyn's shoulders slumped, relief and fear tangling across her face. "If he finds out I gave this to you, I'm finished," she said quietly. "But I can't go on like this, not after what he did to her." She stepped back, retreating into the shadows until the night swallowed her. I stood alone in the glow of the street lamp, the flash drive clenched tight in my fist. Marcus thought he had erased the evidence. He thought silence would hold. But Evelyn had broken, and with her confession, the balance had shifted. Now it wasn't just my word against his. It was the truth against his empire of lies, and the truth finally had teeth. I stood under the glow of that street lamp long after Evelyn disappeared, the flash drive digging into my palm like a shard of glass. The choice was clear. The time for silence had passed. Marcus had crossed lines that could no longer be hidden behind fines or smirks. Now I had what he never expected me to hold, proof from inside his own walls. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office downtown. The building loomed gray and rectangular, its marble steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The interior smelled of paper, ink, and the faint musk of old air conditioning that never seemed to catch up with Texas heat. Rows of counters lined the hall, clerks shuffling papers, attorneys waiting with leather cases, families whispering about deeds and wills. This wasn't Marcus's territory. This was mine. I found an open desk and laid out my credentials, the certifications I'd earned from years of federal audits. The clerk, a man with sharp glasses and a careful demeanor, examined them before nodding slowly. "What are you filing?" he asked. I placed the flash drive on the counter. "Tampering with digital evidence tied to a homeowners association security patrol. I want it logged under compliance review and flagged for judicial oversight." His brows rose, but he didn't argue. He slipped the drive into a sealed envelope, stamped it with a red seal, and slid the official receipt back to me. Just like that, the chain of custody had shifted. No matter what Marcus did next, the files were now locked into the system. Walking back out into the sunlight, I felt the weight lift just slightly from my chest. But it wasn't over. Filing evidence was one thing. Proving its impact was another. Marcus had allies, and they would try to bury this. If I wanted the truth to surface, I needed more than proof. I needed momentum. That afternoon, I met with two neighbors at a coffee shop just outside the neighborhood gates. The place was loud with the hiss of steamers and clatter of cups, but the corner booth gave us enough privacy. They'd both been fined in the past, one for a lawn that didn't meet HOA aesthetic standards, the other for planting a tree without approval. Neither had fought back. Until now. I laid out what I'd found. The missing minutes in the footage, Evelyn's confession, the official filing at the courthouse. Their faces shifted from disbelief to anger as the pieces clicked together. "He's been doing this to all of us," one whispered, leaning closer, her voice trembling, not from fear but from awakening fury. We let him." "No," I said firmly. "He made you let him. That's how bullies operate. But the second someone pushes back with the right tools, the entire facade cracks." I didn't need to persuade them further. They'd seen enough notices taped to their doors, enough neighbors move out in silence. They were ready. By the time we left the coffee shop, I had their signatures on a statement confirming Marcus's harassment patterns. Small steps, but each one tightened the noose he'd tied for himself. That night, I sat at my desk and organized everything. The flash drive copy, the signed statements, Evelyn's quiet confession, written in my notes word for word. Each piece was a thread, and together they formed a net strong enough to drag Marcus into a courtroom. I thought of Emily, still resting in her hospital bed, her hand on her belly, as she tried to will calm into her body. She didn't need to know the details yet. Not about Evelyn's guilt, not about the clerk's seal, not about the neighbors finally waking up. What she needed was peace, and I was determined to carve it out for her. The air in my office felt heavier as I leaned back, the city lights glowing faintly through the blinds. I'd filed the evidence. I'd begun building the case. But I knew Marcus wouldn't sit quietly. He'd sense the shift, and he'd strike back before I could corner him fully. Still, for the first time, I felt certainty harden in my chest. This wasn't just a defense anymore, it was an offense. The kind that didn't need fists or shoves, just truth sharpened to a blade. And when it landed, Marcus wouldn't have anywhere left to run. By the time dawn broke the next day, I knew there was no turning back. The case I was building wasn't just paperwork and digital logs anymore. It was a direct challenge to Marcus's grip on the neighborhood. Filing the evidence at the courthouse had been the first strike. Now came the preparation for what was next. Making sure when the confrontation arrived, I was armed with more than just files and quiet testimonies. I chose neutral ground for the next step, the community library just outside the neighborhood gates. It was quiet, the smell of old paper and coffee drifting through the air, rows of books muffling sound, so every whisper felt heavier. I reserved a small meeting room in the back, a glass-walled cube overlooking the reading floor. That morning, 3 neighbors joined me there, faces drawn, but eyes sharper than I'd ever seen them. They weren't here as bystanders anymore. They were witnesses who had had enough. I laid out the evidence on the table, the flash drive copy, printed summaries of the tampered timestamps, notes from Evelyn's confession, signed statements from 2 residents about Marcus's intimidation tactics. Their eyes moved over each page with a mix of anger and relief, as if finally seeing their struggles reflected back at them lifted a weight they hadn't realized they carried. "This isn't just about my sister," I told them, my voice steady in the hush of the library. "It's about every fine he wrote, every threat he made, every family that sold their home because they couldn't take it anymore. We have one shot to make this count, and that means being ready, to put it all on the record." One man clenched his jaw, his hands folded so tight on the table the knuckles blanched. "If this goes to court, I'll testify," he said, his voice low but certain. The others nodded, one after the other. Fear was still there, but something stronger was taking root. Resolve. I documented every commitment, every signature. Each one added weight to the case, proof that Marcus's control was slipping. But I didn't stop there. After the neighbors left, I stayed behind, tapping into the public records terminal in the corner of the library. Years of HOA filings were available for anyone willing to dig, and buried in those lines of text, I found what I suspected. Marcus's so-called security program had never been properly authorized by the city. He'd filed no permits, no insurance coverage, no compliance forms. To the outside world, his patrol was invisible, which meant every action he took with that clipboard and that body cam was built on nothing but air. The discovery settled over me like iron. Not only had he tampered with evidence, he'd done so under an authority that didn't legally exist. That wasn't just a crack in the wall, it was the foundation collapsing beneath him. I printed the records and slipped them into the folder with the rest. As I packed up, the librarian glanced over from the desk, her eyes lingering on the stack of papers. For a second, I wondered how far Marcus's influence had spread, how many quiet allies he'd built through fear. But it didn't matter. The case wasn't staying in whispers anymore. By evening, I met with one last neighbor, a retired attorney who lived on the far end of the cul-de-sac. We sat on his screened porch as cicadas screamed through the twilight. He read through the files slowly, lips pressed tight, and when he finished, he set the papers down with deliberate care. "This isn't an HOA dispute anymore," he said. "This is criminal exposure, tampering with evidence, falsifying enforcement authority. You're building a case that any judge will have to act on." The certainty in his tone steadied me. Marcus had ruled with intimidation and silence, but silence was breaking. Piece by piece, I was stacking facts into a wall too high for him to climb. When I left the porch, the night air was thick with humidity, but my chest felt lighter than it had in weeks. The preparation phase was nearly complete. The evidence was airtight, the neighbors were ready to speak, and the system that Marcus thought he controlled was about to turn against him. The only thing left was to bring it all into the open, where he couldn't edit, threaten, or bury it. And that moment was coming fast. The air was thick with anticipation as I pulled into the county courthouse parking lot the following morning. The building rose ahead, pale stone gleaming under a cloudless sky, its columns casting long shadows across the steps. This wasn't the cul-de-sac or the HOA office. This was neutral ground, where Marcus's clipboard meant nothing, where his smirk couldn't shield him from the law. Inside, the lobby echoed with footsteps and hushed voices. Attorneys in press suits carried briefcases, clerks shuffled stacks of paper, and the faint smell of polish and coffee clung to the air. I walked past the metal detector, the folder tucked tight under my arm. Every page inside represented a neighbor's courage, Evelyn's breaking point, Emily's suffering, and my father's legacy. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, rows of wooden benches, polished tables at the front, the state seal hanging heavy on the wall behind the judge's seat. I chose a place near the front, laying the folder carefully on the table. Around me, neighbors began to filter in, Some sat stiffly, hands folded in their laps, while others glanced nervously at the door, as if expecting Marcus to storm in, clipboard raised like a weapon. He didn't storm, he strolled. Marcus entered in a tailored jacket that looked borrowed, his ever-present smirk plastered across his face. He glanced around the room, eyes settling on me for just a second before shifting to the gallery. It wasn't the same smirk he'd worn on the cul-de-sac. It was tighter, thinner, as if stretched too far across nerves he couldn't quite hide. Evelyn came in behind him, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clutching her bag so tight the strap twisted. She didn't sit near him. She chose a bench across the aisle, her shoulders hunched, but her presence undeniable. She'd crossed a line the moment she handed me that flash drive, and Marcus knew it. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered, robes flowing, face stern but not unkind. His gavel struck once, sharp and final. We're here regarding complaints of misconduct tied to the Crestwood Homeowners Association and its enforcement practices. His eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on Marcus before settling on me. Mr. Mercer, you filed the motion. Proceed. I rose, the weight of the moment pressing down like the Texas sun outside. My voice carried steady, honed from years of audits and compliance hearings. Your Honor, this is not a dispute about grass height or parking lines. This is about evidence tampering, unauthorized enforcement, and the reckless abuse of authority by one individual entrusted with the safety of a neighborhood. I placed the flash drive on the evidence table, sliding the sealed envelope with it. This contains raw body cam footage from the HOA's so-called security program. You'll see multiple gaps and timestamps, minutes cut out on nights when confrontations occurred. My professional review confirms tampering, and we have testimony from the HOA's own secretary corroborating that fact. Marcus shifted in his chair, but his smirk didn't return. His hands gripped the arms instead, knuckles pale. The judge nodded to the clerk, who collected the evidence. We'll review the contents in session, he said. Proceed with witnesses. Behind me, neighbors straightened. The retired attorney cleared his throat. The mother with the stroller leaned forward, ready to speak. They weren't silent anymore. One by one, they'd stand and tell the court how Marcus had twisted rules into weapons. And Evelyn, shaking, pale but resolute, would admit the role she'd played, her voice carrying the weight of guilt transformed into truth. I sat slowly, the folder still warm under my palm. This wasn't the verdict yet, but the stage was set, the pieces aligned. Marcus could bluff in the park, intimidate on porches, shout across driveways, but here, stripped of his clipboard and smug tone, he was just a man about to be measured against the truth. The judge adjusted his glasses and signaled to the clerk to prepare the playback. The monitors at the front flickered to life, waiting to reveal what Marcus had tried so hard to erase. And as the first frame loaded, I leaned back, steady, ready. The confrontation was no longer his stage. It was mine. The monitors flickered, grainy at first, before sharpening into the familiar view of our cul-de-sac under the streetlights. The faint hum of static filled the room, the only sound louder than the pounding in my chest. Everyone leaned forward, the judge, the clerk, the neighbors packed onto the benches. Even Marcus, who had leaned back in his chair minutes earlier, was sitting stiff now, his eyes fixed on the screen like he could will it into silence. The footage played, steady and unbroken. Emily stood by our father's Ford, her hand resting on her stomach, her face calm but tense. Marcus loomed into frame, clipboard angled like a weapon. His voice barked out, tinny through the speakers. Violation, illegal parking, escalating fines. The room seemed to hold its breath, and then it happened, clear, undeniable. Marcus shoved her, hard enough that she stumbled back against the curb, her hand flying to her belly as neighbors gasped off camera. The silence in the courtroom shattered with a wave of whispers. Evelyn's hands flew to her mouth. One mother in the gallery clutched her child's arm, horrified. The judge raised a hand, restoring order with a single look. He let the footage run another few seconds, then nodded to the clerk to freeze the frame. The exact moment Marcus's hand connected with Emily's shoulder, her body recoiling in shock. Mr. Greer, the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of the bench, do you dispute what we've just witnessed? Marcus's mouth opened, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, his smirk gone, replaced by a tight, panicked grimace. "The footage, it was tampered with," he finally muttered, his voice breaking on the word. "Tampered with?" the judge repeated, his tone sharp. He turned his gaze to me. "Mr. Mercer, your expertise?" I stood slowly, my heart steady despite the tension vibrating through the room. "Your Honor, my review of the raw files revealed multiple gaps. The metadata shows manual editing, timestamps shifted, frames deleted. This video is not reconstructed. It's the unaltered original Evelyn Harper provided, copied before Mr. Greer's tampering. It is admissible, and it is authentic." All eyes turned to Evelyn. She sat frozen for a heartbeat, then pushed herself shakily to her feet. Her voice trembled, but she spoke clearly enough for every ear in the chamber. "It's true. I cut the files. He told me to remove those minutes, to call it a glitch. I did it. I'm ashamed of it, but I won't hide it anymore." Her shoulders slumped, her hands twisting the strap of her bag, but her words landed like hammer blows. The gallery erupted again. Gasps, mutters, fragments of disbelief. The judge's gavel came down once, sharp enough to restore silence. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing at Marcus. "So, not only do we have video evidence of physical assault, but sworn testimony that you attempted to conceal it." His voice grew colder. "That borders on obstruction of justice." Marcus shifted in his seat, his bravado collapsing under the weight of the truth. His hands twitched against the tabletop, his eyes darting from me to Evelyn to the judge, as if searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. Neighbors began standing. One after another, they voiced what they had endured: fines for trivial matters, threats whispered at night, notices stacked until they broke. The retired attorney laid it out plainly, his voice cutting through the room. "This man has operated outside the law. His so-called security program isn't authorized by the city. He has intimidated this community for years. Enough is enough." The judge listened, his expression unreadable but unyielding. When the last neighbor finished, silence fell heavy again. He looked down at Marcus, who was now visibly sweating, jacket clinging to his shoulders. "Mr. Greer, this court will consider immediate injunctions against your authority, pending further review. In the meantime, you are barred from enforcing or collecting any fines, and this board will be investigated for negligence under your leadership." The gavel struck, sharp, final. The room erupted, not in chaos this time, but in release. Neighbors who had once cowered now murmured with relief, their faces lighter, their voices stronger. Evelyn sank back into her seat, tears streaking her cheeks, but there was relief in her expression too. I sat back slowly, exhaling for the first time since the footage began. It wasn't the end yet, the final verdict still loomed, but Marcus's power had cracked in public, under the weight of truth. And for the first time, the community wasn't afraid of him anymore. The courthouse emptied in waves, neighbors filing out in clusters, voices buzzing with the first real taste of freedom they'd had in years. I stayed behind for a moment, letting the echo of the gavel linger in my ears. The judge's ruling hadn't just barred Marcus from enforcing his phantom authority, it had cracked open the entire foundation he'd built his control on. The board was now under investigation, the fines frozen, the truth uncoiled in plain sight. When I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun struck hard, heat radiating off the stone steps. Emily was waiting near the curb, one hand on the Ford's hood, her other resting against her belly. Her face was pale from the weeks of stress, but her eyes carried something I hadn't seen in months: peace. When she saw me, her shoulders sagged, relief flooding her posture like a weight lifted. I walked to her slowly. The courthouse behind me, still alive, with murmurs of neighbors who had stayed to talk with reporters. The story was spreading, whether Marcus liked it or not. He wasn't the enforcer anymore. He was the man caught shoving a pregnant woman, the man exposed for tampering with evidence, the man whose empire of paper threats had collapsed under the first real test of law. Emily touched my arm. "It's over?" she asked quietly, her voice fragile. I shook my head, careful. "Not completely. There'll be hearings, investigations, maybe even criminal charges. But his hold over us? That's done. He can't touch you, not now." Her lips trembled into a small smile, the first I'd seen in weeks. "Dad would have wanted this," she whispered, patting the hood of the car. He always said this neighborhood should feel like home, not a prison. The Ford gleamed in the sun, its paint chipped but unbowed, a monument to the man who had built it with his hands. It had weathered storms, accidents, years of wear, and now it had outlasted Marcus Greer. That car had become more than memory. It was proof of resilience, a quiet stand against erasure. Behind us, Evelyn walked down the courthouse steps, her shoulders squared in a way they hadn't been when she first came to me. She looked exhausted, but lighter. When our eyes met, she gave a small nod. Guilt still clung to her, but so did the knowledge that she'd done the right thing when it mattered most. For her, too, the silence was over. Neighbors began approaching, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. They shook my hand, thanked me, thanked Emily. One even touched the Ford's fender, like it was a relic of something bigger than all of us. The sense of unity that had been missing for years was finally rising, built not on Marcus's threats, but on shared defiance. Reporters swarmed closer, microphones extended, cameras flashing in the heavy heat. I answered what I could, speaking less about Marcus and more about the people he'd tried to bury. This wasn't my victory alone. It belonged to the mother who finally tore her notice off the door, to the retired attorney who refused to stay silent, to Evelyn, who found the courage to speak when it nearly broke her. As the crowd dispersed, I leaned back against the Ford, the hum of cicadas rising around us. The courthouse stood tall behind me, but it was the street ahead I thought about, the one leading back to Crestwood, back to the cul-de-sac where Marcus had first raised his clipboard and declared war. Returning would be different now. The neighbors wouldn't see him the same way. They wouldn't see themselves the same way either. I looked at Emily, her hand smoothing across her stomach, and thought of the child she carried. This wasn't just about ending one man's reign. It was about ensuring the next generation could grow up without fear in their own homes, without notices taped to their doors, without their safety used as leverage. I straightened, the weight of the folder still under my arm, and spoke to the camera nearest me, my voice low but firm. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. The cameraman nodded, capturing the moment. Around me, the heat pressed down, the day heavy with the smell of asphalt and cut grass, but I felt lighter than I had in years. Marcus had tried to bury us under paper and fear, but paper burns, fear fades, legacy, truth, and resolve, they endure. And now, so would we.